if you go down to the very bottom of your screen, you'll see that there is a Q&A button, and you can put any questions in that you have during the presentation to Steve, and I will pass them to him after his presentation is over. I'd like to thank our sponsors for this evening. We are part of the National Endowment for the Arts Big Read program. One of those things that we do with the NEA is this One Book, One Valley read. We are all in our valley reading Lab Girl, and Alice Eastwood is one of the best lab girls I could think of from Colorado. We also have the Town of Vail and a local family foundation supporting us this evening. One of the other things I'll pass on to you in that Q&A box is a 15-minute presentation by the Museum of Natural History in London from their botanist, Dr. Sandra Knapp, who Alice Eastwood is one of her heroes, and I'll put that connection to her presentation in that Q&A box, but you can also find it yourself if you just Google BBC Alice Eastwood. It's pretty good if you want a little bit more after Steve is finished introducing us. Okay, let me see if I can do this. There we go. Two more lab girls that will be part of our speaker series in February. We will have Emmethy Griffel, who's Betty Ford Alpine Gardens conservation scientist, speaking as talking about her program on saving the alpine one seed at a time. And then in March, Dr. Chris Ray, you may remember her from an earlier presentation. She's one of the world's experts on pikas, talking about some of her adventures in the life of a field ecologist, and I'm sure there are plenty of adventures there. This summer, the garden's focus will be plants are an answer. If you are familiar with Project Drawdown, many of the solutions to our warming planet are based on plants. Plants are a great absorber of carbon emissions in the atmosphere, known as a sink. So along with that theme, we'll have two exhibits. We'll have some speakers and activities to go along with it. So we hope to see you out in the gardens this summer. And I'd like to introduce you to Steve. Steve has a PhD in history and philosophy of science from the University of Notre Dame. He also did research at University of Cambridge on a National Science Foundation grant. He has written a book, many books and articles, and he did a great one on America's first great eclipse. And if you remember a few years ago, we had a great solar eclipse in Colorado. And so he wrote a book about one that happened a little earlier. Steve is a Colorado native, and I really look forward to his perspective on Alice Eastwood, one of the most amazing botanists that we've had in the state. So I'm going to just turn this over to Steve. Thanks.
Thank you, Nanette. And it's good to be back, at least in the sense of being online and back. I did a talk last summer for the Betty Ford Gardens, which Nanette had me or invited me to do. And I sort of touched on Alice Eastwood. So this one, I think, will be fun to kind of drill down on her, because I too read Lab Girl last year, I think. And it's a great book. And I think it's neat that the Vail Library hosts those sorts of things. I know the Pikes Peak Library here in Colorado Springs, where I live, does similar things. Not all of the books interest me necessarily, but Lab Girl is a pretty cool one. So I'm glad you guys are reading that, or have read. Was that last year, Nanette, that you did it, 2020?
No, we're doing it this year.
Yeah, so it's
right now.
Oh,
yeah.
Perfect. Okay, great.
Yeah.
Well, good. So yes, without further ado, let me share my screen. And Nanette, if you don't mind, just make sure this looks good to you all. Let me know, and then I can go for it.
You're good.
All right, great. Okay, well, I'll go ahead and start. And if, I think, like Nanette said, if you do have questions, I'm happy to answer them to the best of my ability. I think most of them will probably come at the end. But if there's anything urgent or whatever, I don't mind. It's pretty informal as far as I'm concerned. So I don't mind if Nanette, if you want to interrupt me, that's fine too, or we can save it at the end, whatever works best for you all. So as Nanette said, yes, I have a PhD in history of science. I am an expert, I guess, if I'm an expert on anything in that field, it's 19th century science and exploration is kind of my what I spent the most time studying. I will admit I am not necessarily an expert on Alice Eastwood, although I came to learn a lot about her as I studied the history of science in Colorado. So when I was asked to do this talk for you all, and I do love Vail very much, so it's really cool to be doing this. I've always been a fan. I was born in Colorado, as Nanette pointed out. I'm a native. And I think that's kind of where I want to start. I'm not going to just jump right into talking about Alice Eastwood. I could, I suppose, when I thought about putting this together, I thought, do I just do the normal biography? I start from her birth and blah, blah, blah about her life. And then she dies and that's it. Do I want to do it that way? And I thought I could, but that might be a little boring, because that's the sort of thing that almost anyone can do. If you're really interested in Alice Eastwood, you could just go on Wikipedia or read one of the articles. And so I wanted instead, because I'm a native of Colorado, I think Alice Eastwood really is amazing. I wanted to kind of talk about my own story as a historian of science and how I came to realize that people like Alice Eastwood was in fact amazing, and that Colorado hosted these interesting scientific facts, because there was a time when I was younger, being born here, that I thought Colorado was just sort of this place of great beauty, but I didn't think anything exciting happened here. So what I'm going to do, and I hope it doesn't seem too self-indulgent, and it's going to go for maybe 5 or 10 minutes or so where I'm not actually talking about Alice Eastwood, and I hope you will bear with me, because I promise you I'm going to bring us back around to her, and in a way that I think by the end will make her that much more interesting for those of us who live or have some affiliation, at least, with Colorado. I'm assuming those of you who are here online today either live in Vail or at least spend time there, or been there enough that you're fascinated by it. So we all have this Colorado connection too. So basically, I'm going to talk about my sort of short history in becoming an historian of science and how that led me back to realizing that someone like Alice Eastwood really was pretty amazing. So it starts with me. And again, bear with me. I hope it's not too self-indulgent, but in 1976, I picked that date because that's kind of when I remember. So that there in the middle, that picture there, the guy in the suit and tie, many of you will probably recognize Governor Lamb. He was our governor, the 70s, at least part of it. And then, of course, that's, if you haven't guessed, me, the little boy. My dad's holding me and my mom is there off to the left. Now, why am I showing you this picture? Well, it has a lot to do with sort of my childhood and my involvement with some of the things that happened in Colorado on the more natural side. My dad is a pretty cool guy. He's still around. He's older now. 1976 was the National Bicentennial, of course, and it was the Colorado Centennial, because we are the centennial state, founded in 1876. So there was a lot of celebrations. And my dad was doing some interesting things. He was, for many years, the director of the Park and Rec Department here in Colorado Springs. And he also did some neat things. He developed this idea that he called volunteer vacations. And it was an attempt to get people, the Colorado, the Forest Service and some of our state parks and Western state parks weren't always in the best shape. And he wanted to try to get people to come out and help work on them. And so he came up with this idea of volunteer vacations, where people would volunteer their vacation time, and instead of spending money and going to the beach or whatever, they would come and they'd be, cooked for and stuff, and given tents maybe, or provide their own, and they would camp and work on the trails. And so this project actually became a pretty big deal, and now it's run by the American Hiking Society. My dad even wrote a little book on it, and it was called Volunteer Vacations. And we learned, in sort of a important presidential day today, I won't talk about current politics, but Jimmy Carter at the time, we were called by a presidential historian about a decade or two ago, who told us that as far as he knew, this little book on volunteer vacations that my dad wrote, it had a foreword by Jimmy Carter, and that historian thought that it was the only book that President Carter wrote a foreword to while he was in office. Not that that's a big deal, and I'm not sure that that's 100% correct. I never followed up on that, but I think that's pretty neat. Point is, here's my dad with Governor Lamb. He's doing things like volunteer vacations. This picture is from an opening of a trail in the Bear Creek Trail here in Colorado Springs. This essentially was my childhood. A few years later, when Goody Gaskell, who many of you know as the founder of the Colorado Trail, when she was just starting out the Colorado Trail, she knew what my dad was doing and came down to the Springs and met with them. And short version is he helped her train some of her first volunteers when the Colorado Trail was being built. And then they both went back to DC a few years later to talk to a meeting with Forest Service rangers to kind of explain how they do it. So a lot of neat things. This was how I grew up. This was how I saw Colorado. Mostly a place that was amazingly beautiful, but kind of, well, I mean, not kind of anything. It was amazingly beautiful, but as I grew older, I started to fall in love with history. My mom on the left there, she's German. And when we went to Germany when I was a teenager, I was blown away. We saw family, but I was, walking through castles and old buildings that were, centuries older than Colorado. And I was thinking, this is real history, and I was sort of falling in love with history. I ended up obviously studying it, getting a PhD, and I'll talk about that in a second. But so my perspective was that Colorado was very beautiful, but it had no history. Any buildings you saw were old ramshackle cabins or mines, and they were all falling down. So this was my skewed perspective. And this is going to lead us to Alice Eastwood. I thought Colorado was amazing, beautiful. I didn't think it had much in the way of history. So I grew up in Colorado. Again, think there's not much in terms of actual history here. As far as I was concerned, all the history was over in Europe. So at Colorado State, I ended up getting my undergraduate degree in history. My parents weren't necessarily thrilled with that at the beginning, but it all worked out. And then, as Nanette said, I was fortunate enough to get into the PhD program at the University of Notre Dame. And my interest was in the history of science. That is the way that humans have looked at, studied, and understood the natural world. My particular focus for my dissertation was on history of astronomy and history of exploration. But it kind of eventually led me to natural history and Alice Eastwood. So anyway, Nanette also pointed out that while I was at Notre Dame working on my dissertation, I was fortunate enough to get a grant from the National Science Foundation to go to the University of Cambridge, where I spent some nice time, basically going through archives and things like that. The department I was affiliated with was this building here. You shouldn't recognize it. If you do, I'd be impressed. But it's the Cavendish Library, or the Cavendish Laboratory, rather. This was where this was kind of the university's main scientific building. And if you've ever seen the Double Helix movie about Watson and Crick discovering DNA, they were in this building and stuff. So I was a little bit further down the lane there, but this was the only picture I could find. But I was at Cambridge studying this guy. And again, I promise you, I know this is supposed to be about Alice Eastwood. We're going to get there, and we're going to get there in kind of a fun way, I think. But I was studying this guy, John Herschel. He was a polymath. He did a lot of scientific work. He did groundbreaking work in astronomy and chemistry and photography, some, not really biology, but he was an inspiration. But first, before I get to who he inspired, if you haven't heard of John Herschel, I don't blame you. But you may have heard of his father, William Herschel, this gentleman here. And if you haven't, I'll just let you know. I'm not sure how big your screens are at home, but you can see the little paper he's holding. This guy, William Herschel, in 1781, discovered the planet Uranus, right? It was the first planet ever discovered by men, or humanity, I should say. And now, of course, there were other planets that we knew about, but those are all visible to the naked eye. The planets beyond Saturn, like Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto, and that's not really a planet anymore, but were not visible. So they had to be discovered by telescopes. William Herschel discovered this planet. We call it Uranus. He called it George's star after King George III. This was in 1781, right? Just a few years after George lost the American colonies. He was over the moon. He was also a little cuckoo, as you may know, but he was over the moon because he felt, and it was even said in court, there was a sort of a quote, and I'll paraphrase, but they said that although we may have lost the American colonies, we gained an entire world through the generalship of, or through the efforts of General Herschel. Now, William Herschel was not a general, but they were just saying that in military terms. In other words, okay, we lost the colonies, but hey, we got a whole new planet. William Herschel was very smart. He named this planet for King George, and George thought that was cool and brought William Herschel to Windsor and gave him all the money he wanted to build big telescopes. Okay, and yes, we're going to get to Alice Eastwood, I promise. There was also Caroline Herschel. I bring her up because she was William Herschel's sister. She was a famous astronomer in her own right. She discovered a bunch of comets that had never been found, and she was, in fact, the first professional female scientist in England, and possibly all of Europe, because King George also gave her an annual stipend because of her fame as a comet hunter. And she was a great, sort of like a mother to John Herschel, who I was studying. And King George gave them so much money that William Herschel was able to build these gigantic telescopes. This one was the biggest at 40 feet. And King George would send dukes and princes down from Windsor, because this was down the lane a little bit. So William could show it off. And it was sort of a patronage thing where William showed the king's guests his amazing telescopes. And William was very famous at this point because, again, he was the first person to have ever discovered a new planet. So how does that get us to Alice Eastwood? John Herschel, the little boy who I was studying, grew up in this interesting scientific environment with a great scientific father and a scientific aunt. And her influence on him was in many ways probably more powerful. And again, since we're talking about lab girls, I think the important women of science like Caroline Herschel are good to sort of bring to your attention. So John Herschel, who I was studying, grew up to be the most influential man of science in the 19th century, really. I mean, he was best known in Europe, but he was well known in America too. He was particularly looked up to by this gentleman. If we were together in a room, sort of pre or post COVID, I would say, who recognizes this person? But since we're all online, it's a rhetorical question, but I think most of you know this is Charles Darwin, right? Darwin was a few years younger than John Herschel and looked up to him greatly. And now we're inching a little bit closer to Alice Eastwood. You all know that Darwin took a round the world voyage of many years on HMS Beagle. And he just so happened to be going, the Beagle was going around the Cape of Good Hope and landing in Cape Town the same time that John Herschel was there when I was studying. So Darwin was quite keen to stop and talk to him. And they sort of had this relationship, and Darwin very much looked up to John because John was encouraging scientists of the day to try to look into the puzzle of life. How did life form? How, in particular, were species, how did they develop and form and change, and how were those changes passed on? And while Darwin is certainly probably the most famous British scientist of the 19th century today, in his own day, he acknowledged, as everyone else did, that John Herschel was kind of their leading light, their role model. So much so that if you go to Westminster Abbey in London and go to the great tomb of Isaac Newton, which is hard to miss and it's beautiful, right at the foot of and Isaac Newton is possibly Britain's best known scientist. At the foot of Isaac Newton, you will see these two graves in the floor. Charles Darwin is obvious, right? The guy next to him, it's in Latin, no one knows who it is, but that's John Herschel. And John Herschel died before Darwin. So the fact that Darwin was buried next to Herschel was, the honor was Darwin's, okay? Again, we are inching closer to Eastwood because we're starting to talk about biology now and life. And of course, Darwin's most famous book was The Origin of Species. He honored John Herschel by quoting him in the very first line of his book. The opening line, which is sort of famous, When on board HMS Beagle, I was much struck with certain facts in the distribution of the organic beings inhabiting South America, and in the geological relations of the present to the past inhabitants of that continent. These facts seem to throw some light on the origin of species, that mystery of mysteries, as it has been called by one of our greatest philosophers. Well, that great philosopher that he was referring to was, of course, John Herschel. It was John who was encouraging 19th century naturalists to sort of look into how species came to be and they changed, right? And this leads us to our next gentleman. And again, I was studying John Herschel. I was writing a dissertation on him. So in my mind, I'm starting to say, hey, there's some pretty neat stuff going on, not just in astronomy, but in the natural world too. And of course, that isn't a revelation to anyone, but it's not what I was focusing on. But I became more and more interested in naturalists in the 19th century. Which leads us to this guy, Alfred Russel Wallace. And Wallace, as you may know, and if not, I will tell you, he was the co-discoverer of the theory of evolution by natural selection. The very short version is that Darwin waited for almost 20 years to publish his Origin of Species after the Beagle got back to London, because he was quite nervous, not only about the implications of his theory for things like religion, but also because he was very fastidious and he didn't think he had enough facts. He spent decades working on things like barnacles and that sort of thing. In the meantime, this younger guy, Alfred Russel Wallace, was in the Malay Archipelago and just out of the blue wrote Darwin, said, hey, Charles, I know you're very famous from your voyage on the Beagle. And, I've kind of been thinking about species and I've got this idea about how they might work. And Darwin freaks out and because he's afraid that Wallace is going to scoop him. And of course, Wallace is half a world away at this point. It only came by letter. But again, to make a long story short, they were both of their letters were read at the Royal Society around the same time. And they were both given credit for the discovery, but Darwin had done much, much more work, and he was ultimately given credit for it. Which leads us to the last step before we get back to Colorado and Alice Eastwood. Because the problem with natural selection when the Origin of Species came out was that what was the proof that species were able to pass on these traits? Okay, let's say a bird has a mutation and it has a beak that allows it to crack a certain nut better than its competitors, its fellow birds, and it survives better, passes that trait on. How does that trait get passed on? That's what they didn't understand. How are selected traits passed on to offspring? And it really wasn't solved in Darwin's day. It really wasn't solved well into the 20th century, because we, of course, know that the answer, how traits are passed on, is through a genetic encoding. But they didn't really understand genes, and they certainly didn't have the structure of DNA. I mean, that didn't come, like I said, till Watson and Crick figured it out in the 1950s. So that's a good 100 years later. But what they could do is look at the way species were distributed around the world, be they plants or animals, what have you, and to note how similar species had slightly different adaptations in different parts of say, the islands of the Galapagos, which is a great example, or as far away as, Asia versus North America, right? Botanists could look at the same sorts of things and see how a certain species of, say, saxifrage might be slightly different in North America versus Japan versus Siberia. So distribution was kind of the name of the game for naturalists in the 19th century. It was definitely something that Alfred Russel Wallace was interested in, and that finally leads us back to, of course, Alice Eastwood. And it's what led me back it's what led me to realize that when I started looking into it, a lot of these naturalists who were interested in this problem about geographical distribution of species, be they plants or animals, were very interested in Colorado. And that had a lot to do with the fact that Colorado, in the 19th century, later 19th century, had a great train system, some small towns like Denver and Colorado Springs. And so naturalists started to come here to Colorado in droves. And now we're at Alice Eastwood. And I hope that didn't seem too circuitous, but I really think it helps us to embed her in a larger context of not only, the state of science in her day, but also this network of scientists, were really the leading minds of the day, and she was going to be right there in them. So now let's talk about Alice Eastwood. Alice was born in Toronto in 1859. Her mom died when she was young. And eventually her father moved her, and she was the oldest, so she had to take care of her siblings, her younger siblings. So she already had sort of a maternal instinct. But they moved to Denver in 1873. She graduated in 1879. She was valedictorian, which probably might not surprise you when you learn about all the other neat things she did. But it was called then Shawa Covent Catholic High School. I believe now that's Denver East High School. And then after she graduated, she taught there until about the 1889 school year. In her free time, she loved Colorado, just like I did, and most of us, I think all of us do. And so she just taught herself. She was an autodidact. She taught herself botany using the two best known manuals, Asa Gray's manual and Coulter's manual. And she looked at other, she was quite familiar with Torrey's Flora of Colorado. So she was quite a good botanist, but she didn't realize this yet. She just knew that this was her passion. She really loved it. And just kind of for fun, here's a lithograph I found of Denver in 1878. I got permission to use this in my eclipse book, America's First Great Eclipse, and that was 1878. So this is kind of what Denver looked like right about the time Alice was a young woman in her 20s, going into her 30s. Denver's a small, little town on the frontier, a lot of cute little houses and that sort of thing. So that kind of helps provide some context. So how does this tie back to everything that I talked about before, especially leading up to Alfred Russel Wallace? Well, Wallace came to Colorado in his later years. He was known, he was well known, but not as well known as Darwin. Darwin was already somewhat wealthy when he was, from a wealthy family. And then he made a killing on his books. Alfred Russel Wallace was not quite so lucky. He was well known, but he just wasn't quite as, he just wasn't as famous as Darwin. So near the end, as he was getting older, he needed money, which for lack of a better term. So he came to America hoping to do a lecture tour, which was very common for all kinds of intellectuals and famous folks and performers, singers, that kind of thing. He came to America for a year, give or take, to do a lecture tour. And there's a travel diary you can look up. It's kind of interesting. He really was smitten with Colorado. He rode the narrow gauge railroad of the Denver and Rio Grande all over when he could. But really, he spent most of the time on the East Coast where the people and the money was. And then he went to California. So he did in the fall of 1886, he was up and down the East Coast. And then kind of wintered over, and in the early spring, summer, was going to California. And on his way to California in 1887, he stopped in Denver, just because that's where the train stopped. And he said, I'm going to come back. And he was asking around, he said, I'm going to be back in later in the summer. Does anyone know a good botanist? And everyone, apparently, whoever he talked to, said, oh, yes, you've got to talk to Alice Eastwood. So he meets her briefly. They make arrangements that when he returns after his time in California in July, he will meet up with her and she will guide him to some great botanizing spots in Colorado. And that's exactly what happened. He came back in July, and she took him out for about 5 days of what they always called botanizing around Georgetown and Gray's Peak. And this was not entirely unique, just so you know. Botanizing was a very popular pastime for folks, especially for women. You could walk into almost any frontier stationery store, which would also be a tobacconist and maybe with a blacksmith out back. But you would always be able to find a book, a book of blank pages, leaves that was used for pressing flowers. So botanizing was a very popular activity, especially in Colorado, because as you know, Colorado was a popular spot for tourists coming out from the East Coast. So that's what they did. And Wallace was absolutely thrilled. He gushed that they saw the American Alpine flora at the snowline in perfection. He really thought that the area around Gray's Peak was basically all one would need to get a good handle on the botany of North America. Now, he knew that it didn't have samples of every sort of species, but he just thought if you were to pick one spot, you couldn't do worse. You could do much worse than Gray's Peak. It was really just for him the epitome of botanizing in North America. And here's just some pictures. This is Gray's Peak, looking at Gray's Peak from Torrey's Peak. Many of you may have been up there. And I'm going to read just a brief section from someone else who met Alice Eastwood later on, and what he remembered that she told this guy about her time with Alice. So this is just a recollection. But Miss Eastwood told me of her adventures on Gray's Peak with Alfred Russel Wallace. He was out in Colorado some few years ago, and she actually had the good fortune, to go botanizing with him on Gray's Peak for several days, wherein they found many plants. They lost their way. They got played out in a storm and had to subsist on bacon rind and flour, and had many other equally exciting adventures. So that's sort of one recollection. So, which leads us to the gentleman that I read this passage from. And this was a guy named Theodore Drew Allison Cockrell, another Englishman who had tuberculosis. So he came to America, to the West. And, of course, we were a major convalescent center. In fact, I grew up on the Woodman Road in Colorado Springs, where they used to have a number of tuberculosis huts, which were pretty interesting. So this guy, Theodore Drew Allison Cockrell, was a naturalist himself, and actually ended up being one of the most prolific ones. He wrote, I think, some 9,000 articles on zoology alone. And so his articles, some of them were just a paragraph in a journal or something, but he didn't have a thought he didn't write down. So he was excited to be in Colorado for what it offered from a natural science perspective, but he was bored out of his mind because he couldn't find anyone who he thought was sort of worthy of his own intelligence. So he was in Westcliff, he's actually in the Wet Mountain Valley, which is where Westcliff and Silvercliff are. And he's founded this Colorado Biological Association. Even though they had meetings and had these cool flyers and ads, don't get the impression that it was necessarily a huge affair, but it was something, and he was an eager man of science and was happy to take anyone who would come. But he really, and you can read it in his letters, he really was not impressed with most people. When he went to Denver the first time, he was pretty disgusted. He said, I can't even find, the library has nothing. There's no good bookstores. He just wasn't impressed. So when Alice Eastwood comes along, because she joins his association in 1889, he's absolutely thrilled. And so what I'm going to do, she comes down to visit him in Westcliff, and he's so excited to have someone to talk to that they go, they go out, do some botanizing. But his view of her, which he recorded afterwards, tells you, I think, a lot about who she is, and also how desperate he was to sort of have someone he could relate to. So anyway, this is Theodore Drew Allison Cockrell. He actually went on to be at Colorado College for a year in their Natural History Museum, and then ended his career at Boulder, where he spent a number of years and did quite a bit of good work. So this is Theodore Drew Allison Cockrell, and I'm going to read a few passages about what he thought of Alice Eastwood, because it gives us a sense of who this amazing Alice Eastwood was. He says, certainly I have never enjoyed any talk so much since I left England. That is a conversation with Alice Eastwood. Miss Eastwood herself is not remarkable to look at, with plain and rounded, though rather interesting features. She's aged about 30, but she is utterly different from the people here, and vastly superior. And in her conversation and opinions, she quite reminds me of you. And he's writing this letter to his sweetheart back in England, who he had to leave while he's in Colorado, recovering from tuberculosis. So that's one opinion of his, or one description of Alice Eastwood. He goes on to say, let me flip pages here. Miss Eastwood is so entirely sincere and enthusiastic, and never says things do not matter or she doesn't care. And I suppose this is what places her so far above the ordinary run of people here in the West, who are both selfish and superficial. Flattering, I guess, for Alice, but maybe not the rest of us. And then one more quick description of what he says. Miss Eastwood and I went over to the herbarium, that is where he keeps his specimens, in the morning, and Miss Eastwood named a few erroneous identifications of mine, which was very fortunate, as as there is no telling how long I might have continued to call the plants by their wrong names. I read that passage because I tried to give you the impression that Cockerell was a pretty important botanist and zoologist of his day. And here's young Alice with no formal training. Remember, she only has a high school degree, correcting him and setting him straight. She probably did it very kindly, and he was very appreciative. So already at this young age, with again no formal education, Alice Eastwood is impressing very important people. Which takes us to the next stage in her career. That was 1889 when she met with Cockerell. And that was also the last year she was a teacher in Denver, because in 1890, she goes to California to collect specimens. And while she's there, she meets a woman named Catherine and her husband Townsend. Their last name is Brandegee. And Catherine goes by Kate. Kate is the curator of botany at the California Academy of Sciences in San Francisco. Well, these two are so impressed with Alice that they want to hire her. And Kate, who is the curator of botany, even takes a pay cut to bring Alice on board and to make her co-curator, which is good because 2 years later, Kate resigns. They move down to San Diego. They're a little bit older than Alice is. And Alice suddenly, within a few years of quitting her teaching job, is the sole curator at the California Academy of Sciences. And this is how it looked on Market Street. It wouldn't look like that forever, though, which I'll get to next. So for a good decade, Alice Eastwood is basically running her own botany department at the largest and most prestigious sort of scientific institution in the West. And then, unfortunately, and she's building up the collections and that sort of thing. So I'm building up to something dramatic. Unfortunately, the 1906 San Francisco earthquake and fire strike. And here's how it unfolds. And this is an episode that sort of shows if anything shows how amazing Alice Eastwood is, I think this episode does, although there's lots of instances to point to. It's April 18th, right at 5:12 a.m., the quake hits. It lasts for a minute. I looked it up. Of course, they didn't have the same sensitive equipment, seismographic equipment that we have today, but by all estimates, it was right around an 8.0, 7.98 on the Richter scale, which is massive, right? So we know how big this quake is. And then San Francisco is putting in gas lines, natural gas. And so soon afterwards, fires break out. Alice she doesn't live right in town. She lives close to town. She starts running. Once everything settles down, she heads into town and sees the smoke, runs into the academy. And this is what it looks like. I've sort of skipped ahead here, so I'll get to this in a second, but just look at the picture. This is afterwards. This is the aftermath, but she enters on the ground floor. I don't think it's the bottom floor. I think it's the second one up. I think the bottom floor is the basement, but still her collections are, I think, on the 5th or 6th floor. So I think it goes even a little bit higher. The earthquake hit, it destroyed everything. There's a marble staircase that goes up to the top floor, or to all the floors, but it's cracked. So what she does, the iron railings are still sort of together, and they're actually holding the staircase together in spots. So she starts climbing up the iron railings, using it to get over the big gaps in the cracked marble staircase so she can get to the top. The place is not on fire yet. The academy is not on fire, but the fire is just a couple blocks away. She knows she's on limited time. So what she does, there's another, one of her fellow colleagues is there, who came to check on the place. Remember, it's not even 6 a.m. quite yet. And she says, we got to get this stuff out of here. Now, what she knows, the collection, the botany collection was already about 100,000 specimens. She knew she couldn't get them all, but what she does is she saves what are called the type plant specimens. And type specimens, whether they're plants or animals, are the ideal, a specimen that demonstrates the ideal characteristics of a given species. So just like, there are, Paris used to hold, they've changed it now, but for 100 years, from the late 1890s, Paris held there was a vault in Paris. You may know this story, where there was the ideal kilogram. There was this ball of platinum or a cylinder of platinum and iridium. It was the exact weight of a kilogram, and it was the kilogram by which all other kilograms were judged, right? If you needed to know if something, like if a country wanted to know if they had the standard kilogram, they would compare it to this one. Well, that's what a type specimen, or a type, in this case, the type plant was. It was the ideal specimen of a saxifrage or a potentilla or a geranium or what have you, that showed the exact characteristics of what the ideal an ideal sample of this species should show. So anyway, what Alice had done, which was unique to most collections, whether they were plants or zoological collections or botanical collections, most museums at this time kept their type specimens interspersed with their regular collection, with the samples that weren't quite so ideal. She had already gone through the process of separating them out. She just thought it was easier to have your type specimens separate from your main collection. Well, on this particular day, she probably thought she was, even more of a genius than she was, because they were ready to go. They basically stuffed them into her apron. They found every bit of rope and cord they could find. And she and her coworker, she crawled back down the stairs and the railings, and they lowered them down and got these specimens out before the fire engulfed the building. So she got out about 1,200 specimens. Had she not been separating them, they would have been lost. As it was, the entire collection, the rest of the collection of 100,000 specimens in the California Academy of Sciences were lost. And it was at the time the largest collection in the Western United States. So I don't know if that's not amazing. I don't know what is. A month later, for the magazine Science, she wrote, "I do not feel the loss to be mine, but it is a great loss to the scientific world and an irreparable loss to California. My own destroyed work I do not lament, for it was a joy to me while I did it, and I can still have the same joy in starting it again." And that just shows the kind of person she was. She said, "Well, we lost him, but you know what? We can rebuild this." Unfortunately, she didn't get to do it right away because the California Academy was destroyed, and they didn't rebuild it right away. So she was basically unemployed for about 6 to 7 years, during which time she traveled to Europe and around America. She visited other important botanists and their herbaria. She was given a few seasons of funding. For example, Harvard sent her to the Yukon, which of course has very short warm seasons. They wanted her to collect some willow specimens. So, she got to go out and do some botanizing. And after a few years of this, she was hoping to go back to the California Academy of Sciences when it was rebuilt, but it was a slow process. But as they were trying to rebuild, she got wind of the fact that those responsible for the California Academy were going to rebuild it without a herbarium. And she charged right over there and said, "I don't think so. That's not going to happen." And so she's very persuasive, and she convinces them that, yes, in fact, we are going to have a herbarium and I'm going to run it. And so 10 years after the earthquake, the California Academy of Sciences did reopen in Golden Gate Park. It's since moved again, but that's where it was. And they thought that was well away from, should another earthquake happen, that would be a safe spot for the Academy. And that's where she spent pretty much the rest of her career until 1950. By 1942, with her own hard work out in the field and working with other collectors, she had got the California Academy's herbarium collection back up to, well over 100,000 that they lost, and it had 300,000 specimens in 1942. So she was obviously very tireless. And so that kind of brings us, to the end. I'll spend a few more minutes and then open it up for questions. But let's go over her career. She was at the California Academy for 50 plus years. She died in 1953. She started in 1893, but of course there was a bit of a gap after it had burned and while they were rebuilding. So really, but she was there for 50 plus years, and she gained an incredible reputation around the world as one of America's best botanists. During that time, she was traveling widely, and so she was very well known, like I said. Interestingly, she was very humble, and she refused all honorary degrees. And again, she only had a high school diploma. She was offered honorary doctorates and other degrees, and she said, "No, thanks. I'm good. I appreciate it." I think the most interesting honor happened in 1950, just a few years before she died. The 7th International Botanical Congress was held in Sweden, And again, this woman, and she was a woman, most of the folks were men, without a degree other than high school. They made her the honorary president, and she got to sit in Carl Linnaeus's own study chair. Linnaeus, if you don't know, was the Swedish gentleman, who basically founded the science of taxonomy. And, when you think about the kingdom, genus, species, that kind of, the taxonomy, the way that we categorize all living things, he came up with that system. So, and especially with the binomial genus and species, Canis lupus, Homo sapiens, that was all that started with Linnaeus. So the fact that, and he was Swedish. So putting her in his chair was basically saying, you are at the head of the botanical world at this time. So in other words, it was a very, very great honor for her. And she was 89 at this point. So quite an old woman, very well esteemed. I think this quote from her is pretty cool, and it's a good way to kind of wrap this up. To me, the feeling that comes from the order and law of the universe is truly religious, and I think that every scientific person must be religious without any kind of belief in a dogma of any kind. And so this sort of brings us full circle, I think, with my story about how I started out as an historian of science, because when I was a kid, I just thought Colorado was this beautiful place. But as an historian, which kind of took me a roundabout route to Europe and back, I discovered that Colorado has this very rich history after all, especially when it comes to science and natural history, because many of the great 19th century naturalists thought of Colorado as a great and wonderful biological laboratory where they could hunt, search for and hunt if they were, zoologists for specimens that sort of typified the North American biome, the whole North American ecosystem. So naturalists like Alice Eastwood got their start right here in our own backyard. And I think that is really pretty neat. And I hope you see that Alice Eastwood was, in fact, a rather amazing woman, and her connection to Colorado is pretty cool. So I'm going to stop sharing the screen here and bring it back to Nanette and see if there's any questions.
We'll just give people a few minutes to put some questions in. For all of you that are interested in that Alice Eastwood talk from the Museum of Natural History in London, I put it in the chat box. For some reason, it wouldn't let me put it in the Q&A box. So I also wanted to thank Steve for talking about one of my heroes, Alfred Russel Wallace, because as a geologist, Alfred Russel Wallace was a fantastic guy. That work he did in the Malay Archipelago was one of the first places where you had documented biology that proved the edge of tectonic plates, because there were species that had drifted past each other and changed over time. So it was pretty interesting. He was a guy that wasn't really respected in England because he didn't have the right pedigree.
Right.
Here in the U.S., someone like Alice Eastwood could become
I think you're
famous.
I think you're absolutely right. In a way, Wallace was kind of like Alice, right? I mean, he was very intelligent and mostly self-taught, but he didn't have the pedigree and quite the education and the connections of someone like a Darwin, right? In America, it was much easier for Alice Eastwood. Wallace, I think, was probably raised to the level he was, but he was always sort of subordinate in the scientific community to Darwin, and that was just the way of it. So,
yeah, I think all I've gotten is just thank you, little smiles for you so far. No questions. You sure nobody out there has got anything to ask Steve before we?
While you're thinking, let me just I've got this book here, right? So remember I talked about Theodore Drew Allison Cockerell, who went on to Boulder. Like I said, the guy didn't have a thought he didn't write down. I'm kidding. But when he did pass away, his office at Boulder, at CU Boulder, they just sent workmen in, and he probably didn't throw anything away either, but there were thousands of pages of notes, all this important stuff, because he did a lot of work too, not only on the botany and zoology of Colorado. so he had all these papers and so many letters. And it's so crucial for historians to, if we want to understand the past, letters are a key source. And so anyway, but the workmen went in, they said, well, Professor Cockrell passed away. We need his office, go clear it out. So they sent these workmen in, and they just started dumping his stuff in the trash, basically. And one of his colleagues walked by and basically said, what are you doing? So he salvaged all this stuff. And so out of it, we got, right here, this is a 500-page book. You can kind of see it's, typical textbook type size print, but these are all his letters just from his time in the Wet Mountain Valley, just 3 years. So, and this is where I got some of that interesting stuff about Alice Eastwood. So, email is a totally different thing. They didn't have it back then, but it kind of shudder to think how much interesting information would be lost if, when things like that happen, and if people who care didn't say, hey, don't throw that stuff away. So, because as I was preparing this lecture, you can find a lot of stuff online, and there are some better known names who talked about how they interacted with Alice Eastwood, but I never found anything by Cockrell, and I think he was pretty important in terms of his interaction with Alice Eastwood early on. So.
Well, it looks like we have a pretty quiet group where
That's
we
okay.
have no other questions for you tonight, but I really appreciate, Steve, you doing the research for us, and
Pleasure.
I look forward to working with you in the future.
All right, sounds good. Well, thanks again for having me, and I hope you all stay safe and get some skiing in. I'm sort of missed that. So
yeah, mostly just lots of thanks to you.
Okay.
So thanks a lot, Steve.
All right.
Have a good one.
Pleasure. You all take care.
Okay, good night.
Bye.